Good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be here to moderate this panel. My name is Victoria Lee. I work in the Human Rights and Disability team of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I'm very happy to be joined here by these very distinguished experts from different UN bodies. So we have Samuel Kadwe, who is a member of the Committee on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have Melissa Upreti, who is a member of the UN Working Group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and practice. And Velina Todorova, who is a member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. This panel will be looking at intersectionality in the work of the UN. I think it's very timely that we have this discussion, given that there's this global commitment through the Agenda 2030 to leave no one behind. And certainly that includes reaching out to those who are furthest left behind. So certainly that includes persons with disabilities, women and girls with disabilities, children with disabilities, and other persons who identify with the most marginalized groups and their intersections. We know today that it continues, the laws and policies we have today continue to expound these singular frameworks and approaches which dismiss the multiple and intersecting identities which we all have, in which women and girls, children with disabilities, older persons with disabilities. So we need to use intersectionality as a tool to be able to recognize and capture the distinct uniqueness of the lived experiences of discrimination and violations in order to better address and redress them. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to my colleagues here to first consider how their respective mandates approach intersectionality, to what extent the committees and the working group are looking at this in the work that they are doing. So I will first pass the floor to Samuel, and we're very privileged because Samuel was also involved in the drafting and the negotiation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We know that Article 6 and Article 7 look particularly at women and girls with disabilities and children with disabilities. So he could also give us some background as to how those provisions were put forward and eventually adopted, which really helps, of course, looking specifically at the situation of these marginalized groups. So, Samuel, I pass you the floor.
Thank you very much. I already have a mic. Thank you very much. As you have heard, my name is Samuel Kadwe, and I'm glad to be here. I've been here since Tuesday, and I know we have said so much about intersectionality. And as Victoria has said, it's necessary to go back to the negotiation of the CRPD to see how issues of intersectionality have developed within the CRPD mandate. The promulgation of the convention was a very participatory process, and for this reason, issues of intersectionality were addressed because many people were there, and as we have said here, intersectionality has to do with diversity, multiple identity, and we are trying to see how all these multiple identities could be, harnessed so that they are not purely multiple grounds for discrimination, but they can synergize each other to help us approach the issues of rights of people who have multiple identities in the right way. Women were very concerned during the negotiation of the convention, and this issue came in, it was originally not in the draft that had been made before. But especially women from Korea came very, very strongly about this, and they were joined by other women. And with this article, which reflected that whole issue of intersectionality. You will recall when we talk of the Human Rights Charter, it talks of rights for all. But because of this diversity, we have come up with these other new conventions which address this diversity. That's how the CEDAW came in. That's how the CRC came in. That's how the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came in. But even in between them, we find diversity and concern for consideration of intersectionality to really achieve the goal of rights for all. In the area of particularly women, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been very, very concerned, and for this reason has come up with a general comment, number 3, on Article 6, and this general comment addresses the concern of intersectionalities that is related to women with disabilities. And this covers women and girls as well as older women with disabilities, looking at issues that affect them. One of these concerns has been equal exercise of legal capacity. And in that connection, and in connection particularly with another Article 12 of the Convention, earlier on, the committee had come up with another general comment on legal capacity, which is the bedrock of all issues relating to enjoyment of rights. If you don't have a legal capacity, it's very difficult for you to participate or to enjoy any other of the rights. And so the first thing that we consider is ensuring that the legal capacity of women and girls with disabilities is enhanced, is protected, is secured, and this may include such other issues as, access to education, access to health, access to economic rights, access to sexual and reproductive rights, and there has been also a great concern regarding how women with disabilities have been treated within the communities, within the societies where they belong, particularly when you consider that intersectionalities brings in even the issue of not only gender, but where you come from, sometimes your color, sometimes whether you are indigenous in a place that is dominated by a larger group, and all these intersect to compound disability, and if they are not looked at, if they are not observed, they become grounds for discrimination. So violence on women and girls with disabilities has been a major concern within the committee, and this has been documented a lot, particularly where we have looked at the laws in different countries and seen that women with disabilities tend to be invisible in these laws. Women with disabilities seem not to be part of the women movements in many of the countries. Women with disabilities seem even marginalized within the organizations of persons with disabilities. And all these are issues of intersectionalities. The whole question of humanitarian situations, where special needs of women with disabilities are not observed, and where they are bound to suffer more than other women. So in our concluding observations in many of the countries that we have been interacting with, in our interactive dialogue with the different parties, state parties, these are some of the concerns in the area of intersectionalities that we have found it necessary to emphasize, to bring awareness on, to raise concerns where these things are not properly documented, and more so also to urge for the building of the capacity of women with disabilities to organize themselves into groups that can champion their own concerns and their rights. The issue of intersectionalities that we have also been able to look at very closely is that of children with disabilities. And children with disabilities, again, is another article in CRPD, Article 7. And this article, again, was one of those that came up as a result of considering all the rights that had already been discussed and seeing that their children with disabilities stand out as a special category with a special identity that need to be recognized in the jurisprudence of rights. And that's how this particular article also came into the convention. We have been looking at issues of children, and we have been also noticing that children are not properly addressed when it comes to rights, particularly in most party states. And recently, we are coming up with a new general comment. We are still in the process of formulating it. General comment number 7, that is touching on Article 4, subsection 3, and Article 33, subsection 3, on issues of participation, on issues of ensuring that people with disabilities, through their organizations, are able to fully participate in decisions that relate to their issues, are able to participate in the society. And we are here even considering the whole question of best interest, sometimes raising the question that is in CRC on best interest, who really determines best interest, and so the need to bring about guidance on children in terms of what does it mean when we say that what we do must be in the best interest of children. One of the unique situations of unique provisions of the CRPD, particularly in this regard to children, and that quite well addresses this question of best interest, is that of evolving capacities of children. This evolving capacity calls for ensuring that we respect the right of children with disabilities. We consider their participation in accordance with their age. We consider the whole question of preserving their identities. And particularly, we would like to see a situation where girls with disabilities do not have their integrity, body integrity violated for any reason. Children are also very vulnerable in situations of risk, and this has been another concern of our mandate. There are other areas that we have found ourselves involved in, particularly when it comes to the intersection of disability with other characteristics that have already been dealt with or are still being dealt with, like race, where you may find somebody is a woman, is a different race in a particular area, and may also suffer psychosocial disability And so it's treated in a different way. We have had situations where people are subjected to taser guns as a way of controlling them. We have had situations where people are denied services because they are not part of the larger communities. They may be indigenous in a place where the domination is by other people. We have situations where people are considered differently because they are migrants. They come from elsewhere. They are asylum seekers. They are refugees. And all these issues bring about intersectionality, which the CRPD in its mandate is trying its best to address. There is also synergy, particularly between CRPD and other treaty bodies like CEDAW and CRC, where we have noted, for instance, Kenya was being reviewed this year by CEDAW, and there was a very good presentation by women with disabilities that was sent, and CEDAW was able to consider this and to bring out these issues of economic justice for women with disabilities, even in situations where we are talking of women organizations. The whole question of violence in women with disabilities as compared with other women. CRC also has an article specific to children with disabilities. And this also brings about that kind of a synergy that we are talking about. And there has been other areas that different treaty bodies have come together to address very specific concerns. Maybe some of these will arise as we move on. So, what are we saying about the mandate of CRPD? CRPD recognizes multiple identities. And these multiple identities could be a source of grounds for discrimination or could be viewed as ways of strengthening the position of the right holders to defend themselves in all fronts, depending on how many identity one has, which bring about issue of discrimination. We are also saying that there will be situations of multiple discrimination, and this may arise as a result of your gender, may come up as a result of your age, may come in as a result of your place of residence, may come up as a result of your sexual orientation, and all these interact with each other and must be addressed as we address the whole realm of human rights. The humanitarian situation, we are talking of it as requiring specific response that addresses people who are otherwise marginalized for other reasons, who are discriminated for other various reasons, among them disability, since this is our main focus in the CRPD. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. We can see that indeed the CRPD committee is very much embracing the approach of intersectionality. And I think it's largely also due to the fact that it's one of the newest human rights treaties. So it really has many innovations, and it benefited from the experiences and the lessons that other committees went through. So we can see that within the treaty itself, certainly there are those provisions on women with disabilities and children with disabilities, but also on humanitarian situations. So it's really imbedded embedded into the text of the treaty itself to facilitate really looking at all the different marginalized groups and their intersections. So we will now move on to Velina, who's a member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. As Samuel mentioned, there's a particular provision, Article 23, on children with disabilities. So it's been one of the committees who has, from the very beginning of its mandate, been addressing children with disabilities. But Velina, perhaps you could shed some light on how that has evolved over the years, if there's been any notable development since the CRPD also was adopted and came into force. Velina, thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you, Samuel, for your introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to organizers for inviting me to this very important summer school. It's the first time for me to be here, and I feel a little bit scary, but you will help me. Well, Victoria presented my tasks, the tasks of my introduction. I prepared some written material which is sent to the organizers. To prepare for this session, I went through the general comments adopted by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and also through some of the past and current concluding observations of the committee, looking specifically at the parts where the committee speaks and makes observations and recommendations with regard to children with disabilities. All these materials are open to the public. They are at the website of the OHACR, so it is any research is possible. For the time I have today, I will try to mention the main points and the main developments, the evolving concept of the Committee on the Rights of the Child on the subject of intersectionality, because unlike the CRPD, the Convention was on the Rights of the Child was adopted in 1989. And it reflected the situation of that time, but it is worth mentioning that when adopted, our convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was the first core human rights treaty to refer explicitly to the rights of children with disabilities, prohibiting discrimination of any kind, including on the ground of disability in Article 2, and providing for special rights of disabled children in Article 23. In the general comment number 9 of the committee, adopted in 2006, at the eve of the adoption of CRPD, and it was very much influenced by the debate around the draft Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Committee on the Rights of the Child notes that Article 2 requires state parties to ensure that all children within their jurisdiction enjoy all the rights enshrined in the Convention without discrimination of any kind. Reading Article 23, the committee underlines that its paragraph 1 should be considered as the leading principle for the implementation of the Convention with respect to children with disabilities, namely the enjoyment of full and decent life in conditions that ensure dignity, promote self-reliance, and facilitate active participation in the community. That article, you may know, have been critically examined in the literature, because it was said that it conceptualizes the intersection between childhood and disability by undue welfarism and medicalization, as well as for lacking specific and explicit obligations of the state parties how to achieve and practice the social inclusion of children. The position of the committee has changed during the years to promote a shift from the traditional paradigm of protection to one where the children with disabilities are seen as rights holders who are supported to have their views heard and taken into account in decisions that affect them. The right of the child to be heard is commented in the General Comment 12 of 2009. Maybe we will discuss this because there is a slight difference between two conventions on this principle, but nevertheless, our committee says that the right to be heard is applied both to an individual child and to a group of children, for example, children with disabilities or girls, and is conditional because the Convention says that on the assessment of the age and maturity of the child. Importantly, the committee states that it is not up to the child to first prove his or her capacity. Rather, state parties should presume that the child has the capacity to form his or her own views and recognize that she or he has the right to express them. Further on, there are several areas of concern, of particular concern of the committee, that the committee pays particular attention on the rights of children with disabilities with the view of non-discrimination. The first area is violence. In its general comment number 13 of 2011, the committee promotes and the human rights-based approach to children with disabilities, saying that the child rights-based approach requires a paradigm shift towards respecting and promoting the human dignity and physical and psychological integrity of children as rights-bearing individuals as a fundamental assumption in its interpretation of the Convention. This is quite a good step ahead. The committee also developed its concept, its view that children with disabilities may face multiple discrimination that results in denial of rights. Already in 2009, while interpreting Article 2 of the Convention, the committee said that a disability as prohibited ground for discrimination affects children with disabilities as one of the most vulnerable groups. Further on, the committee changed its view on vulnerability. Instead of focusing on individual impairment of children, actually the committee placed the focus on factors of the environment, thus coming closer to the social concept of disability, interpreting disability as a social fact and coming closer to the CRPD's interpretation and definition of disability. In order to address intersectional discrimination of children placed in institutional care is another area with a great concern of the committee. And also, it's an area that is addressed slightly differently by the CRPD and by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But our committee elaborates specific observations and recommendations with regard to institutionalization of children of disability. For example, the committee is very concerned when discussing factors for institutionalization of children for care and for treatment, especially for forced treatment. It always pays attention to support to be provided to families, not to be separated, and to provide care for children. Also, quality of care institutions and preparation of children to leave the institutions when they reach the age of majority. The recent jurisprudence of the committee, the recent concluding observations, makes it evident that the rights of children with disabilities is given much increased attention. This development could be attributed to many factors, including the existence of CRPD and the strong disability movement, as well as the increased experience of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, already observing 5th to 6th periodic reports of the state parties. The change in working methods is also influential to place frequently the rights of children with disabilities among the particular concerns in the concluding observations, and to issue concrete and detailed recommendations. If you go through the recent jurisprudence, let's say from now on to, let's say, 2-3 years ago, you will see that we select particular areas in which we consider the states need more efforts to reach the fulfillment of the rights of children. Children with disabilities, their rights are very frequently placed in the areas of concern. The advanced view on disability of the Committee on the Rights of the Child can be detected also in the terminology the Committee uses recently. For instance, in the concluding observations issued after reviewing the 5th and 6th periodic report of Guatemala of this year, the Committee expressed its deep concern about multiple and intersectional discrimination against children with disabilities in all areas of life, and recommended the state to adopt a human rights-based model of disability, etc. In the list of issues prior to submission of their next periodic reports, in the May-June session of this year, the Committee invited Hungary and Croatia to provide information on the measures taken to eliminate in practice discrimination, inter alia, multiple or intersectional forms of discrimination. Well, another very important area, I don't have time to discuss the areas of adolescence, where the Committee draws attention to of the state parties to the rights of adolescent children to sexual reproductive health and education, specific measures to prevent and protect them from violence, sexual violence, especially girls with disabilities. But I would like to go to the area of education. Here we have this very clear evolving concept of the Committee on Inclusive Education. The notion of inclusive education has been cautiously expressed by the Committee in the past. In its general comment number 9 on the rights of children with disabilities, there is a paragraph on inclusive education where the Committee conceptualized the inclusive education as the goal of educating children with disabilities. But the Committee also thinks of at that time that it is inclusive education needs a lot of investment, and it should be achieved progressively through investments in the school environment, in teaching materials, in professionals at school, society, and parents. So this is the view of the Committee of that time. Progressive achievement that makes a segregation unavoidable in some states. This is 2006. Currently, the Committee is much more specific in commending good practices in inclusive education and applies a much stronger language, recommending the state parties to prioritize inclusive education. For example, in 2017, Moldova received a recommendation to strengthen access to inclusive education at all levels, including preschool and high school education, for all children with disabilities, including psychosocial disabilities, to ensure that all schools are accessible and continue to develop tools and the capacity of teachers, including those qualified in sign language. In its general comment on the implementation of the rights of children in adolescence, the comment was issued in 2016. The Committee notes with concern that number of adolescents in marginalized situations who are not given the opportunity to make the transition to secondary education, such as adolescents with psychosocial, sensory, or physical disabilities. Proactive measures are necessary to end discrimination, etc. I would like to mention also that much attention is given by the committee to the rights of children with autism, especially their right to inclusive education, and they shouldn't be subjected to forced institutionalization. Also, the committee has always recognized the right of all deaf children to have the possibility to learn and communicate in sign language. Such a recommendation you will find in many concluding observations, also, for example, the last one to Denmark. To conclude, the jurisprudence of the committee, particularly after the adoption of CRPD, shows not only the increased attention to disability, but also the shift in the concept under the human rights-based approach. The intersectionality approach is part of this development, but needs further attention. It already demonstrates that its benefits to address the barriers to fulfillment of rights rather than to the single concept of disability. The potential of intersectionality concept to draw much more attention to the factors causing discrimination and to address these factors is evident in the more concrete observations and recommendations made by the committee recently. What are the obstacles? The obstacles that the committee faces is the insufficient data. There is almost no country to provide to the committee reliable, sufficient data about the situation of children with disabilities. So the committee constantly recommends the country to organize this disaggregated data collection. Also, lack of specific strategies and plans, good legislation, coordination mechanisms, etc. One last point. There is a new optional protocol of the convention, third optional protocol on communicating individual communication procedures. It entered into force. The committee already has been addressed by many individual complaints. But not from a child with disability. So there is a great potential to use this mechanism to address the committee by individual complaints, of course, following the protocol, its regulations. I am saying there is a great potential because on individual cases, the committee has much more freedom to develop its jurisprudence, its concept and terminology, including on intersectionality. Thank you very much, and I will take part.
Thank you, Valina. You raised many, many important points for us. And I think it's very positive to see that the Committee on the Rights of the Child is very much embracing CRPD's approach and adopting the human rights-based approach when they are addressing children with disabilities. And exactly the example you gave on inclusive education, I think, is very telling. The fact that their approach to education of children with disabilities has evolved over the years, and especially since the entry into force of the CRPD, it really shows that how the committee is working to reinforce that view and that position. And of course, that's what we need, because the messages coming from the treaty bodies to the states really need to be coherent in order for them then to be implemented on the ground. So it's very important. And you also mentioned the fact that we are lacking in data, and that the CRC committee is consistently asking for disaggregated data as it relates also to children with disabilities. This is something we see across all the treaty bodies, the call for disaggregated data, and this is also why it's embedded into the Sustainable Development Goals under Goal 17. Without the data, it's not possible to effectively formulate policies to target those groups, especially persons with disabilities. And finally, your point on the individual communications, I think it's, and this is something which you all can engage in seeking and helping those communications to be sent to not only the CRPD committee, but the other committees and other mechanisms available. We need to see the rights persons with disabilities being discussed by the other treaty bodies and mandates, and not only the CRPD committee. And I just want to mention that the CDL committee also has this mechanism, and it has addressed a specific situation of a deaf girl who was raped, and this is a communication against the Philippines. So, and there they did very much adopt the approach taken also by the CRPD committee. So it's very positive to see this. So I would like to ask Melissa if you could share with us how the working group is addressing women with disabilities and using intersectionality as a tool. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Victoria, for moderating the panel, of course, the organizers for having me here, and my fellow panelists. Before I dive into my presentation, I'd just like to ask how many of you were here yesterday in my session, just so that I don't repeat. Okay. I think that's a good show of hands. It means that we have a bit of a foundation here, so I will not sort of repeat a lot of what I said yesterday, but maybe just make a few points in the beginning because some of you were not here. As Victoria noted, I'm here as a representative of the UN Working Group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and in practice, and this is a special procedures mechanism that was established less than a decade ago. So a lot of people actually don't really know about its work, but as you can tell from its name, its mandate is very broad. We look at discrimination against women. We are one of three human rights bodies, the other two being CEDAW and the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, that really focus on women's issues. So in that sense, I think very relevant to this discussion of intersectionality and women with disabilities. Since women are not a monolithic group, I think for us, taking an intersectional approach is not really a choice, but it's a necessity. And it really goes to the heart of our mandate and our approach. And this was clarified, I would say, in our very first thematic report to the Human Rights Council, where we said that women with disabilities, their concerns are really cross-cutting. They touch upon every aspect, every area of work that we look at. The working group has published a number of thematic reports. We are not our work is not grounded in one particular treaty. It's really grounded in the themes that we prioritize for ourselves, which are obviously shaped by the international legal framework. So our first report was on political and public life. Our second report was on economic and social life, with a focus on the impact of austerity measures. Our third report was on health and safety. Our fourth report was on family and cultural life. And our fifth report was on promising practices. In the first four thematic reports, issues pertaining to women with disabilities were discussed to varying degrees. And I think I'd like to emphasize that point also to make what I think is a more important point, that even when we talk about women with disabilities, even women with disabilities are not a monolithic group. There are so many subgroups and so many different priorities and concerns that arise for this very large group. So I acknowledge the fact that the working group has not been able to go very deeply into all of the issues and concerns, and I think that is an ongoing challenge, not just for the working group, but for anybody, and even for activists perhaps working in this area, that there are many nuances and there are many very specific issues and circumstances that need to be taken up. So how do you sort of really ensure enough focus on all of them is a challenge that we all face. That being said, It's definitely been a priority, and our work, our analyses and the thematic reports usually provide the basis for a lot of what we do in connection with our country visits and communications that we send to governments, as well as statements that we issue quite often, actually, in response to issues as they unfold on the ground, and also our position papers, which we publish where we feel that there is a conceptual gap or some kind of misconception on a particular topic. So women with disabilities have figured in all of these work products, perhaps, that really have guided a lot of work that's happened on the ground that activists have taken up. And we do draw very heavily from the work of other treaty monitoring bodies as well as special procedures. We also work collaboratively with them and jointly issue statements. We jointly issue communications to governments. So there's a lot of, in terms of our method as well, there is a lot of engagement across the board and interaction to also make sure that our efforts are coordinated. There are, of course, sometimes what I guess is commonly referred to as divergences. I think that is a reflection really of just really some of the challenging nature of some of the issues. And I know some of those have been discussed and will be discussed today and tomorrow, so I won't go into those right now. But what I'm going to do, kind of building on yesterday, is provide a few examples of country reports where I think the working group has been able to touch on many critical areas of women's lives and engage with states around those. So, for example, we have country reports where we've dedicated entire sections to discussing issues pertaining to women with disabilities. We've made key observations and recommendations, all of which reflect an intersectional approach, and that recognize that the impact of discrimination may be exacerbated by disability. And we've also recommended special measures. So, for example, in the working group's report on China, following a country visit, the working group welcomed the extensive measures taken by the government in accordance with the Constitution and certain specific laws to support women and men with disabilities, reduce poverty and protect them from violence, exploitation, and abuse. And it specifically noted the quota system requiring all state and private employers to set aside a small percentage of jobs for persons with disabilities. The working group also took this opportunity to highlight concerns expressed by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that it was set out in their concluding observations on the initial report of China to the committee regarding the lack of definition of discrimination against persons with disabilities, the issue of forced sterilization and abortion, and the prevalence of violence. So this is an example of how we cross-reference the work of other committees. I think it really shows how the working group plays a kind of monitoring role as well, and we do try to focus on implementation and enforcement, because it's not enough to just generate norms, but we really also need to make sure that they are enforced. And this is one example of how the working group goes about doing this. In the case of Chile, other issues were addressed. So we noted that under legislation establishing norms on equality of opportunity and social inclusion for persons with disabilities, the state must adopt the measures necessary to ensure that women with physical or mental disabilities are able to fully enjoy and exercise their rights on an equal footing with others, especially as regards their dignity, right to form and be part of a family, sexuality, and reproductive health. The working group also noted that a number of people who were consulted during the visit stressed that the rights of persons with disabilities are still not fully respected, especially with regards to access to health, education, work, and the full enjoyment of civil and political rights. The working group also expressed their concern at the lack of official statistics enabling the specific needs of persons with disabilities that are required for sound policies to be introduced. So we've taken the opportunity to put the spotlight on gaps. We've also taken the opportunity to reinforce important gaps and to also echo what other treaty monitoring bodies or special procedures may have said. And I think that's a good example of, that's a good way to avoid duplication while reinforcing things that need to be enforced. And that's the kind of approach that we take in our work. The working group's country report on Peru did not have a separate section on women with disabilities. The ones on China and Chile did. But it did make some key observations and also recommendations. For example, the working group noted that people who belong to ethnic minorities have disabilities, who live in rural areas, or whose mother tongue is an indigenous language, do not have equal access to public services or the opportunities available to those whose mother tongue is Spanish and who live in urban areas. I think the way this is written, it also reflects, I think someone mentioned this perhaps yesterday, maybe I did or someone else did, the issue of the word limit in formal reports. And that's a challenge. On the one hand, it forces us to be very succinct and very concrete and to choose our words very carefully. On the other hand, it is really a limitation. And I'll say two things about that. What ends up happening is sometimes we make these what seem like general references, but when you read these reports, please remember that if there's a reference, it made it in there. And I think that is very important to remember. So really looking at that still as being something very positive is important. And then there are always annexes that go along with the reports. So if there's a reference in the main report, there's a very strong chance that there's a more elaborate, resource behind that, and there's an annex. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So when commenting on Peru's policies, just to move forward with Peru, the working group regretted that the Equal Opportunities Plan for persons with disabilities does not include specific measures to address the specific problems of women with disabilities. And the working group took this opportunity to express their regret with regards to gaps between policy and practice, in that women with disabilities do not derive any benefit from the special protection under the National Plan to Combat Violence Against Women. And based on that, recommendations were made to extend the coverage of the social welfare program to include the rights to family and child benefits, maternity, sickness, and disability payments, and old age pensions. Recommendation was also made to implement cross-cutting policies and programs to tackle multiple discrimination, including various groups of vulnerable women, including women with disabilities. So again, I'm providing these examples also to give you a sense of the different types of issues and areas and topics that we've touched upon, and where we've taken an opportunity to emphasize some of the gaps and barriers and challenges faced by women with disabilities. Finally, with regards to Spain, Spain is another example, and in this report we did very specifically, again, cross-reference the work of the CRPD in a discussion on the impact of austerity measures on women. There is an androcentric bias in economic policies and the entire economic system that really puts women at a disadvantage in general. And that disadvantage is exacerbated, I think, for women with disabilities. So I think this observation by the working group is very important, very relevant. And it was noted that vulnerable groups of women have been particularly affected, and the working group referred to concerns expressed by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that employment policies in Spain do not include a comprehensive gender perspective, and that unemployment, inactivity, and training rates are significantly worse for women than for men with disabilities. So in some of our reports, we've also sort of taken a very gendered approach and looked very specifically at how women in particular are disadvantaged, and that to women with disabilities. So I talked about some of the limitations that make it difficult for us to get into nuances earlier, but there have been times when we've actually sort of tried to take that kind of approach. In the same report on Spain, we discussed stereotypes in the media, and the working group noted with concern the multiple discriminatory stereotypes faced by women in vulnerable situations, including women with disabilities. In a discussion on violence against women, the working group emphasized that women with disabilities are among those most vulnerable to gender-based violence. The working group noted that the incidence of psychological violence and subjugation among girls between 16 to 19 years of age is 25% as against 9.6% for other age groups, and highlighted that among women with disabilities, 23.3% are reported to have suffered gender-based violence compared to 15.1% for women without disabilities. So where we have found data, we have also cited data, and that, having data really helps us, I think, enables us to pinpoint very specific problems and disparities and disadvantages. In discussions concerning women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, again, in the report on Spain, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we noted that this convention guarantees full and equal legal capacity to persons with disabilities, recognizing that the denial of legal capacity to persons with disabilities has in many cases led to their being deprived of many fundamental rights, including their reproductive rights. So the issue of legal capacity is relevant to a very broad spectrum of rights. While the working group supports the extremely important goal of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the human rights of persons with disabilities, the working group has noted that the approach chosen to avoid any type of stigmatization should not be detrimental to women's autonomy and decisions over their own body, and a woman's human right to choose whether or not to continue her pregnancy. And I think I made this point yesterday as well, that we've taken a very strong and clear principled approach on women's autonomy, and we also have a position paper on sexual and reproductive health and rights that touches upon this. We also submitted an amicus brief in a case concerning Zika to the government of Brazil. We worked with other special mandate holders, including the Special Rapporteur on Persons with Disabilities, and we did cross-reference the Convention on Persons with Disabilities as well. So we have, we draw from different legal sources, and we also work with other procedures and mandate holders, when we have done that, when we've taken these positions. I'm going to end now by just touching a little bit upon how we may work together more effectively to across movements. I think that's been one of the themes this week, and things that we've been trying to think about is how do we work across movements, how do we work together as activists, and also how do we engage with each other, civil society, academics, students, other activists with formal mechanisms. I think one important thing that I'd like to note is that there is a need to strengthen and deepen collaboration among mandate holders themselves and treaty monitoring bodies, and that is something that we are constantly trying to do in Geneva, and OHCHR has a key role to play in supporting that effort. Our working group has long sought to contribute to the work and to work with other mandate holders in order to mainstream a women's rights perspective throughout the special procedures system. As I said yesterday, there are around 55 special procedures, mandate holders, only 2 focus on women. Everyone is supposed to take a gendered approach. Gender mainstreaming is a priority within the system. It has not always been achieved, but I'm happy to see more and more special rapporteurs actually coming out with reports that have a stronger focus on gender, on women. And I would say overall, there are some positive trends, but there's a lot more to do, because I don't think it's enough, as much as the working group, as much as the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the CDAW committee, it's like we have the responsibility of almost holding up the rights of half the world. It's not something that we can do alone. So I think it's something for all of us to think about. How can we make sure that we really mainstream gender and the concerns, in this case of women with disabilities, in the work of all mechanisms and all bodies? And we heard from the presentations this morning that that has happened to some degree, but I think that's an area that we all need to try and focus on a little more and think about strategically. And that's where civil society organizations and academic institutions can play a key role. And I think this summer school is actually an example of that, because by providing a space where we have been able to come together and talk about our work and what has been done and engage with you, and hopefully you'll have some questions and comments about what can be done. This is a very good example of a positive effort in that direction. I think another way in which we can try to overcome the challenges is the working group has identified its thematic priorities for the next few years. Our next thematic report will be on deprivation of liberty, the different contexts in which women are deprived of liberty. And that, I would say, is an opportunity for people to contribute. You know, if you send information to us in the form of background papers, or if academic papers, academic institutions can do that. When we convene, we have briefings where we invite civil society organizations to come and share information with us, to tell us about women's experiences and to make recommendations about what needs to be done to address specific issues. I mean, that's another way to engage with the working group. So that's our first one. Our next report will be on the one after that will be on women in the world of work. The International Labour Organization right now is working on a new convention to address violence against women and men in the world of work. I mean, that itself, I think, is a very important opportunity to raise issues pertaining to women with disabilities. We know that the level of unemployment is very high, opportunities are very low, and the incidence of violence, the risk is very high. And the working group will be doing a thematic report on that issue, so that's another opportunity, I think, to raise some of the issues that you may be concerned about. The one after that will be on sexual and reproductive health and rights in crisis situations, so conflict as well as humanitarian situations. Again, another opportunity for you to provide information to mainstream some of your concerns in some of these broader thematic reports. And actually the one that follows might be on legal capacity. And I think that will be a report that you will want to sort of make a contribution to and share information with the working group. Finally, I think another way to overcome the challenges is really for us to be able to listen to and reflect the voices of as many women as possible. I think as activists, civil society organizations, academics, I think you, in many ways, are probably closer to the problems that we are trying to address from where we are in our formal capacity as working group or committee members. So we do rely on you for that kind of information. And so you can play an important role in ensuring this by communicating to us what you hear from women. And for example, when the working group goes on country visits, by connecting with the working group, by facilitating engagement, I think that can be very, that's helpful. That's another very strategic way in which you can utilize the working group. And, then that can result in some kind of meaningful outcome in terms of norms as well as enforcement for women on the ground. So there are many opportunities, but I will stop there and maybe during the Q&A, sort of provide some more ideas, and happy to respond to your questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Melissa. And thanks for sharing the future work of your committee, of your working group as well. It's true that we need to take advantage of these opportunities to provide information. The more information we give, the more likely that it will be raised in your reports, and then the more likely, hopefully, that it will actually be implemented on the ground. I think your point about the word limits is definitely something we need to keep in mind. It's something that all the committees and working groups struggle with because there's such a high demand to ensure inclusion of all the different groups. And sometimes we see, and this is something we've noticed, for example, with the CDL committee, that often, they look at all the different themes, and then at the end of their concluding observations, there might be a paragraph which is dedicated to vulnerable groups, where rural women, indigenous women, women with disabilities are all put together. And certainly for civil society, for the advocates, it's not enough, because then it's harder to convince and push the government to take specific actions. So we always welcome when there are specific references and celebrate that, because it really serves as a tool when you get back home on the ground for implementation. And I think your point about diversity within the group of women with disabilities is very important. We're talking about women with psychosocial disabilities, autistic women and girls, women with disabilities living in rural areas, indigenous women with disabilities, each with who have faced specific barriers, and we can't. We would be doing a disservice just to clump them again into one kind of homogeneous group. So thank you all for sharing how your specific mandates address intersectionality. I think it's very promising to see that children with disabilities, women with disabilities, and all their intersections are being addressed in your work. And the fact that they can all serve to mutually reinforce the rights of persons with disabilities generally. This is the whole point of the exercise. But what happens certainly when intersectionality is a tool which is of great benefit, when of course all those messages concerning the different groups are coherent. But when they are not coherent, they don't then achieve their purpose. So as you, Melissa, you refer to the divergences, there are still divergences across the UN mechanisms and also at the regional levels. So for example, when it comes to older persons, we know that the CRPD committee has adopted a general comment on equal recognition before the law and legal capacity, and they very much support legal capacity for everyone. But when we look at the regional level, for example, the protocol on older persons to the African Charter, we see some disparities. You know, they refer to incapacity and even best interest of older persons, which goes against all of the human rights standards at the international level. And those act as a barrier to ensuring a coherent approach. And then there are other examples where perhaps they're not completely conflicting, but there's insufficient attention being paid. So in the Council of Europe, there is this convention against violence against women, convention on, which is on violence against women, the Istanbul Convention. And the monitoring body is quite new. And so they've just begun their work, but looking through their reports and the recommendations, violence against women concerning women with disabilities is not very much looked into. I mean, there are some references, but when we look at CEDAW or the CRPD committee or the CRC, they are very much addressing this and recognizing that this is an issue which needs urgent action. So we need to ensure that at all levels within the UN structure, at the regional levels, that there is a consistent approach. So I wanted to ask each of you, and we'll start with Velina, how your committee, I mean, if you're aware of certain divergences, and how your committee is addressing that so that we ensure that there is a common approach when it comes to the rights of children with disabilities. And maybe you want to use this?
It works. Okay. Divergency between the treaties and the way the treaty bodies interpret and apply them, these divergences. Well, Okay, sorry. Well, I already mentioned some of these divergences. First of all, there is a difference between the two conventions with regard to the right of the child to be heard, to participate in all matters that decisions are taken for the child. The Convention on the Rights of the Child recognizes the right of every child to be heard, as Article 12 reads, is who is capable of forming of his or her own views, the right to express those views freely. So there is a condition in an Article 2 of capability of forming views, and CRPD does not require such condition for the child to be heard. Another different divergence between the two conventions is with regard to the alternative care for children with disabilities, institutional care. Another divergence we find with inclusive education, also best interests of the child. So you will find how we address these divergences. Of course, the committee applies the convention and is trying to interpret the articles of the convention in a dynamic way, context related to the context, and the committee always, after 2006, always refers to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in its general comments and in the concluding observations in the related areas. So this is a way to somehow to avoid slightly different messages. The concept of the Committee on the Rights of the Child is also evolving, as I have already mentioned, in the areas of education, inclusive education. Hearing of children, we stick to our concept of assessing the capacity of the child to express his or her own views. Also, in the area of institutionalization, I think it's well known that the committee, the UN also issued this guidelines on alternative care for children. So institutions is viewed by the committee as the last option, and only if in the best interest of the child. We always urge the states to start the institutionalization process in their jurisdictions, to establish alternative forms of family types of care, and also to assist, as a matter of prevention, more importantly, to provide assistance to families to keep and to take care for children. So I know that CRPD has another view that institutionalization should not be taken as opportunity at all, but still our view on that at least if there is no other option, proper care for the child should be provided. Education, I already spoke about that. I think we have a very similar view with regard to discrimination of children in the context of international migration. I didn't mention that. The committee issued last October, together with the Committee on the Rights of all Migrant Workers and members of their families, 2 general comments on the rights of children in the context of international migration. And I would like just to make reference to one of the paragraphs of this, general comment number 322, where the committee actually gets very closer to the language, to the strong language of the CRPD, recommending the state parties to put special emphasis on the policies and related regulations about the prevention of discriminatory practices towards migrant and refugee children with disabilities, and the implementation of necessary policies and programs for ensuring the full enjoyment of human rights. And I'm getting closer, on an equal basis with children who are nationals of the state. So we have taken the language of CRPD. So these are, I think, the areas of divergences. And I think there should be better communication and collaboration between the two committees. It already started under the drafting process of the General Comment number 7 on participation of persons with disabilities. The committee asked for discussion. We met with members of CRPD. We discussed certain issues in the draft comment, and we reached, more importantly, we reached the consensus that certain paragraphs of the draft document should be changed in line with the participation rights as enshrined in CRC. Well, I could stop here and waiting for the next question.
Talk on the thing. Ready to say something on the thing?
Melissa, so you've already spoken about how the different mandates and mechanisms could work towards a common approach. Have you, in your work, not necessarily only from the working group, but perhaps from the CDL committee or others working on the rights of women, have you noticed some divergences when it comes to the rights of women and girls with disabilities?
Well, I think some of the substantive areas of divergence have already been touched upon. I think more generally, just in the area of sexual and reproductive rights, though, and I apologize for constantly bringing up sexual and reproductive rights. That's what my background is in as well. I've spent 20 years working in this area, so my mind tends to immediately sort of be filled with examples. I think perhaps on issues pertaining to, again, consent, autonomy in different contexts, I think there are some variations in approaches. So maybe, for example, the CDL committee recognizing certain circumstances in which sterilization of women with disabilities may be permitted is one area where I believe there is divergence for us in the working group. Like I said earlier and even yesterday, we've taken a very clear stand based on the principle of autonomy, that any limitation on that women with disabilities cannot be granted less autonomy than other women, that it has to be consistent for all women. Disability cannot be a ground for taking away that right. And that has reflected in our position paper on sexual and reproductive health and rights that focuses on autonomy. And I would encourage you to read that. It's a very interesting and I think very strongly worded position paper. It also reflected in our amicus brief in the Zika case that we submitted to Brazil, where we also, like I said, cross-referenced the work of the CRPD. So I think that is probably one strong example that comes to mind. So just on the issue of divergences more generally, I would also like to add, I think a number of, the substantive examples have been provided, but in terms of what they mean, I think the divergences are to some extent a reflection of divergences within the movement as well, perhaps, right? There are different views and there are different positions taken by people within the movements. There are also divergences that result from gaps in information and data. And so I think some of these divergences can be addressed and, it doesn't have to be these formal mechanisms alone, but I think, again, through engagement and a process of evolving positions, these can be addressed over time, because the treaty monitoring bodies and special procedures, we do try to engage, and the working group, I know special procedures extensively cross-reference the work of treaty monitoring bodies to avoid duplication. Our mandate requires us to take an approach where we complement the work of other bodies. So that process, that method of cross-referencing is also that's one way to help prevent divergences. But there's definitely a challenge that we face is, again, limited opportunities to really interact and engage. So this is a good opportunity. I was in Washington, D.C. in March, where I had the opportunity to participate in a meeting of regional commissions from Africa, Latin America, as well as a host of special procedures and treaty monitoring bodies. I mean, individual representatives came, and we found that to be an amazing opportunity to talk about issues. We found we were given a common space to talk about issues, challenges, divergences, and to really think about ways to strategize, because even we have to sit down and I think be able to strategize with each other. And those opportunities are not always there. So I think that also lies behind some of the divergences. So even if there is a divergence today, it's not something that cannot be tackled tomorrow. In fact, I think these things need to be strategically tackled. And the one other thing I'd like to add is that, for example, the CDL committee has like 35 members. So think about how much time and energy it takes to come to one position. That ends up being reflected in a general comment or recommendation. I think the reality is that all of these bodies have individual members as well. And so just for them to also come to consensus on an issue, that's a process in itself. So I just wanted to, raise that point as well, as you think about how to tackle some of the divergences.
Thank you, Melissa. And finally, Samuel, if you could share your thoughts and also how the different mandates could work more closely together for this common approach.
Thank you very much. Just to go back a little bit on divergency. One of the reasons for a few of the divergences that have been noted arise from the fact that these treaties have come up at different times. And for instance, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities take it that disability is an evolving concept. Prior to the coming into place, the issue of psychosocial disability was very little known. Actually, psychosocial issues were seen as mental illness and not a disability. Now, that has become a very, very strong area of concern to be addressed in terms of legal capacity, in terms of autonomy, in terms of personal integrity. And that reflects the divergency that we sometimes find ourselves in. Recently, and this is addressing what I've been asked to do, the CRPD committee, a portion of members and a portion of members of the CDO had to sit together to address one concern relating to discussion that was going on in relation to abortion. And the issue was, should disability or potential disability be a ground for abortion? And should abortion be allowed beyond the commonly agreed period of time if disability is discovered in a child? So this, of course, the CRPD has a mandate on persons with disabilities, not on persons who will be born, but you can see that becomes an area of concern for both the CDO as well as for the CRPD. Do we go free on free choice of what a woman wants to do, or do we have limits and guidance on what areas that need control? These are some of the concerns. We have also experienced new areas of human rights issues coming up, like we have the African Protocol on older people, and you find the African Protocol on older people going back towards institutionalization, creating care centers for older people, That is because, that issue is discussed in a totally different context, and there will be need to synergize with the other treaties that are dealing with the same issue of human rights. This morning, we were talking with Victoria over a process that is going on with the Council of Europe regarding mental illness and the kind of restriction, the kind of allowance on involuntary treatment. These are issues that the CRPD is totally opposed to. Involuntary treatment of any type. And you see, that's a little bit of a divergence between people who are also thinking about human rights and the instruments that we already have. Now, how do we get to synergize each other? I said before, there has been a bit of that, and my sister here from CRC has indicated the concerns they have raised within the CRC on children with disabilities. If this is discussed out of the context with CRPD, you can understand that there will be divergence. And I have just mentioned about our communication with the CEDAW and even having a sitting with the members of CEDAW to discuss a particular issue. I feel this direction will need to be strengthened in the UN system. We already have a forum for chairs of these committees to sit together and to address some of the concerns, but that may need to be expanded where even members of the committee sit in the other committee on some particular issues that relate to the other area. And this is where the way we will continue to build that synergy between all of us. So there is need for greater involvement. Of course, now there's a small newsletter that gets out every week, trying to highlight what is happening in the whole area of human rights. And that is creating a bridge. We also have, of course, the website of each other, but you realize, as she has said, each of these committees has a very big load. The CLPD, for instance, is in the backlog because it's the newest convention, and when it was open for ratification, so many countries came up together. It is the convention that was ratified by the greatest number of member states within the shortest time. And so just now we are working on reports that came in 2015 and 2016. So the idea of bringing them together with others has that challenge of timing, but it is not an option. It's something that must be done. We must expand the meetings of the chairs to be wider and to expand their agenda so that they also deal not just with the administrative issues of the committees, but also address content issues, particularly where divergence is likely to be and where times have changed and needs to be done in a different way. And I think that's what I'd like to say in that regard.
Thank you, Samuel, and thank you for also raising that the issue about the Council of Europe's draft additional protocol to the Oviedo Convention, which I think it's titled For the Protection of Persons with Mental Disorders, and its aim is to regulate involuntary treatment, which is, of course, contrary to the CRPD. And I think the discussion about intersectionality and that particular instrument is very pertinent because we know,
I mean, there's growing evidence that women with intellectual disabilities and women with psychosocial disabilities are more likely to be put under guardianship, are more likely to be diagnosed with depression, are more likely to be subjected to electroconvulsive therapy and other forms of forced treatment. But now I would like to pass over to you all. I'm very sorry that there's so little time, but we have been granted 10 more minutes, so we can go to 10 past 11. If we could take some questions and comments. So first here, and then we will go.